Which patriotic song is your favorite? Our country has so many, and they're wonderful. Of course, you think of right away the Star-Spangled Banner, but there's so many others, like older songs like My Country 'Tis of Thee, and newer songs like God Bless the USA, which became popular when I was a child. And many of us have loved singing God Bless America during the seventh inning stretch at a baseball game. You know, we're not aware of a national song of the ancient Israelites. But if there were a national song for the Jews, I'm sure that Psalm 122 would be in the running. This psalm is a declaration of love and loyalty for Jerusalem, the capital city of the nation. Listen to this psalm and what David says in Psalm 122. David writes, "I was glad when they said to me, 'Let us go to the house of the Lord.' Our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together, to which the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. Their thrones for judgment were set, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they be secure who love you. Peace be within your walls and security within your towers. For my brothers and my companions' sake, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord of God, I will seek your good." Now, a major difference between the patriotism of the United States versus patriotism of the ancient Jews is that while our nation is a human republic, their nation was a divine theocracy. Their love and loyalty for their nation was a direct and necessary expression of their love and loyalty for God, who was the direct ruler of their kingdom. The heading of this psalm says that it is a song of ascents of David. Now, being a song of ascents means that this song was one of the songs that the Jews would sing as they would make their pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the three major festivals: Passover in the spring, Pentecost in May or June, and Tabernacles in the early fall. You can imagine the excitement of a Jewish family as they traveled the many miles together to Jerusalem. Like you and I sing patriotic songs on the 4th of July, they would sing patriotic songs of praise and worship to God as they made their way to Jerusalem. That this song is a psalm of David shows the context within the nation of when it was composed. There was relative peace and safety under the strong military rule of David. He had stabilized the nation and subdued the invading Philistines after the failed reign of King Saul. And now he was increasing the might and significance of the nation of Israel in the region. For comparative political and patriotic climate, we might think of our own nation in the early 1800s after the War of 1812. Peace and security, though new and fresh, seemed relatively secure. And there was great hope for potential growth on the horizon. Also, it should not surprise us that David would compose such a psalm. David had a love affair with the city of Jerusalem. Of course, it was known that this city became his capital of his kingdom. And he brought the tabernacle of God to Jerusalem so that God would dwell with him in this city. You may also recall that when David was just a young man, he became internationally famous for slaying Goliath the giant. At this point in his life, David had already been anointed king over Israel, but he had not yet ascended to the throne. Undoubtedly, he'd begun to dream of what his life would be like and all that he hoped to accomplish in this privileged position. At the end of the account of David and Goliath, there's this interesting side note. We find it in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 53 and 54. Here, the narrator says this: "And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent." Now, at first reading, You might not think anything of this verse. I mean, of course he would bring it to Jerusalem. That's where he lived, right? Well, not at this time in history. At this time in Israel's history, Jerusalem was still occupied by the Jebusites, one of the people groups whom God had commanded the Israelites to destroy and expel from the land when they conquered the land of Canaan. David was of the tribe of Judah, and Jerusalem was within the territory of the tribe of Judah, which means that the Judeans had failed to conquer this key city within their allotted territory. And sitting there like a thumb in God's eye was this city filled with Jebusites. And David's zeal for God compelled him to do something about it. After his great victory over Goliath, a Philistine who had defied the God of Israel, David took the head of this Philistine to Jerusalem as a warning shot. This was undeniably a threat by which David was telling the Jebusites of Jerusalem, your day is coming too. On into his reign, David's zeal for God and his love for Jerusalem grew stronger and stronger. And the main point of this psalm could be summed up like this. David's love for Jerusalem was grounded in his zeal for and faith in the Lord. As we read through this psalm, we see three main sections. First of all, the first main section is verses 1 and 2, where we see David's longing for Jerusalem. Here in these verses, he pictures himself as one of the pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem. He says this, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. He imagines hearing the news that it's time to go to Jerusalem. It's time to travel, to visit the tabernacle, to celebrate one of these incredible feasts. And he's overjoyed. He's glad. He's so excited to be there because he's been longing to be in the presence of the Lord. As it says in verse 2, our feet have been standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. It's as if he's imagining times in the past when he was there and enjoying the glory of the Lord in this wonderful city. The second section is seen in verses 3, 4, and 5. And here we see David's praise for Jerusalem. First of all, his longing for Jerusalem, and now, number 2, his praise for Jerusalem. He praises Jerusalem for three things. First of all, he praises it as the pinnacle of military strength. Notice what he says in verse 3. He says, Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together. Jerusalem was a military stronghold. When David had determined to conquer Jerusalem, the Jebusites who inhabited it at that time mocked him for even considering it. In 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6, it says, and the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, you will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off, thinking, David cannot come in here. The city was so well fortified that they thought even blind and lame soldiers could defend it. But through a daring and ingenious plan, David and his men were able to infiltrate the city through a water shaft, destroy their enemies, and conquer the city. Now, having conquered the fortress, David strengthened its defenses even more, and so he praises Jerusalem as the pinnacle of military strength. Verse 4 of this section explains that David praised Jerusalem as the center of religious life. Notice what it says here in verse 4. It says, to which the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. You see, God had commanded the Israelites to travel to the place where he would designate for his name 3 times appointed throughout the year. And after David conquered Jerusalem, he brought the tabernacle along with the Ark of the Covenant to the city, which became the center of religious life for the nation. Here, all of the nation was to travel for the purpose of giving thanks to the name of the Lord. Thirdly, Jerusalem is praised as the seat of justice. David says in verse 5, there thrones for judgment were set, the thrones of the house of David. As king of the nation, David was charged with maintaining authority and justice throughout the nation. And this centered and came from his throne in Jerusalem. It's interesting because in verse 1, he talks about the house of the Lord. At the end of the psalm, in verse 9, he talks again about the house of the Lord. And here in the middle, he mentions the house of David. And he sees that he's blessed by and charged with his authority, not from his own calling, but from God who called him to this position. True justice was a key foundation of any successful society, and it became a hallmark of David's reign and a key feature of the promised messianic kingdom, which would come from the line of David. Of the Messiah, in Isaiah 9, verse 7, it says, "Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this." So David is longing for Jerusalem. He praises Jerusalem. And finally, the third section in verses 6 through 9, we see David's prayer for Jerusalem. His prayer is in accordance with the covenant of God. Notice what he says at the beginning of verse 6. He says, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they be secure who love you. Peace be within your walls and security within your towers. For my brothers and companions' sake, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good." David is praying for Jerusalem, and that first mention of his prayer is right in accordance with God's Abrahamic covenant. That phrase, "may they be secure who love you," echoes the covenant that God made with Abraham, where he told Abraham, "I will bless those who bless you." David's love for this city was based on his faith in God's promises. Also, his prayer is for the sake of his people. Notice what it says in verse 8. It says, "For my brothers and companions' sake, I will say, peace be within you." He loved his people, the people of God, and so he prayed for the city of Jerusalem because that was so key to the safety and security of God's people. And finally, his prayer is for the sake of the house of the Lord. He says in verse 9, "For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good." Undoubtedly, he had a love for the tabernacle and for the Ark of the Covenant, but it was first and foremost the honor of God that was in David's mind. Like he defended God's honor against Goliath, like he defended God's honor against the Jebusites, David was passionate and zealous for the honor of God. And so that's why he had such a love and a passion, and he prayed so fervently for this beloved city of Jerusalem. And this psalm shows the undeniable zeal of David for his God and for Jerusalem. And for us today, from this psalm, we can see a couple principles that should impact our lives. First of all, we should be passionate about the things that God is passionate for. David's love for Jerusalem flowed from his zeal for God. It was God's honor and reputation which were first and foremost in his mind. And you know, there are so many things that we could give our attention to. There are so many things that could capture our lives, but what should consume our lives, we should be zealous for in each and every day of our lives is the glory of God and the spread of the gospel, because these are the things that God loves and desires the most. The question is, do your priorities match God's priorities? Are you passionate about the things that God is passionate about? Secondly, and lastly, we should depend on God at all times. Though this psalm was written at a time of relative national strength and security, David still acknowledged his total dependence on God. Unlike the Jebusites before him, David did not take the peace of Jerusalem for granted. He knew that his success was not of his own making and that he had to be in complete dependence on God. He prayed to the Lord, and he called others to pray alongside with him so that they would remain secure through the power of God. You know, we as Americans do not have promises of divine blessing. God's word does not ensure our success like it did for Jews who kept his covenant. However, we recognize What Paul says in Acts chapter 17, that it's God who made from one man every nation on the face of the earth. And it is God who determined their allotted periods and boundaries, the boundaries of their dwelling place. And as Daniel says in Daniel chapter 2, that it is God who changes times and seasons, and he is the one who removes kings and sets up kings. It's only by the wisdom and providence of God that we as a nation are what we have become today. And it's only by his hand that we will continue. This is why we must depend on God at all times. We, along with David, should pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And we, along with the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 2, should pray for our own governing officials. I encourage you today, as part of your prayer time, to pray for the blessing and salvation of our governing officials. Pray that they will have wisdom from God to rule well in accordance with God's will. Pray for the blessing of God for President Biden and for Vice President Harris, for Senators Moran and Marshall, and for Representative Estes. Pray for Governor Kelly. Pray for our state legislature and for our Sedgwick County Commission. All of us need to depend on the Lord at all times. Throughout this time, our nation is enjoying strength and security that is unprecedented in human history and across the globe. But we must never take that for granted. We must live in dependence on God and in pursuit of his glory above all else, and the pursuit of the furtherance of the gospel throughout the world.